Kanthapura, Chapter 10 by Raja Rao. Kartik has come to Kanthapur. Sisters, Kartik has come with the glow of lights and the unpressed footsteps of the wandering gods. White lights from clay trays and red lights from copper stands, and diamond lights that glow from the boughs of entrance leaves. Lights that glow from banana trunks and mango twigs, yellow light behind white leaves, and green light behind yellow leaves, and white light behind green leaves, and night curls through the shadowed streets. And hissing over bellied boulders and hurrying through delling drains, night curls through the Brahman street and the Praya street and the Potter street and the Weaver street, and flapping through the mango grove, hangs clad for one moment to the giant people, and then shooting across the broken fields, dies quietly into the river, and goats walk by lighted streets, blue goats and quiet goats and bright-eyed goats, and even as they walk in transparent flesh, the dust gently sinks back to the earth. And many a child in Kanthapur sits late into the night to see the crown of this god and that god. And how many a god has chariots with steeds white as foam and queens so bright that the eyes shut themselves in fear lest they be blinded. Kartik is a month of the gods, and as the gods pass by the Potter street and the Weaver street, lights are lit to see them pass by. Kartik is a month of lights, sisters, and in Kanthapur when the dusk falls, children rush to the sanctum flame and the kitchen fire, and with broom grass and fuel chips and coconut rind they peel out fire and light clay pots and copper candelabras and glass lamps. Children light them all so that when darkness hangs drooping down the eaves, gods may be seen passing by, blue gods and quiet gods and bright-eyed gods, and as they pass by, the dusk sinks back into the earth, and night curls again through the shadows of the streets. Oh, have you seen the gods, sister? Then when the night is on this side of the day and the Kartik lights have died down, a child wakes up here and begins to cry, and a cough is heard there, and in Suryanarayana's house a lantern is seen in the courtyard, and the beat of feet is heard here, and the hushed voices of men and women are heard there. Then there is a fuss and a flutter in Rangamma's house, and everyone rubs the eyes and asks, "Sister, who is dying? Sister, who is dying?" And Nanjamma says to her neighbor Ratnamma, "And old Ramakrishnaya? We saw him only yesterday even at the river, and he looked so whole and healthy." And Postmaster Suryanarayana's wife Satamma says, "No, surely it is the heart trouble of Rangamma." And then comes the roar of waterfall Venkamma. "Oh, you will eat blood and mud, I said, you widow, and here you are." And Pandit Venkateshia's daughter-in-law Lakshmi takes her lantern and rushes to Venkamma and says, "And what is it, Venkamma? Oh, daughter of the mother-in-law, what is it but that the Praya polluter has had royal visits?" "But what is it, Venkamma? What? Oh, you are a nice one too, and 3 legs of a bedstead plus 1 makes 4. Does it or does it not, my daughter?" And seeing Timamma and Satamma, she says, "Oh, don't you see the policeman at the footsteps? Oh, you will eat blood and mud, I said, you widow, and here you are." And Pandit Venkateshia's daughter-in-law Lakshmi takes her lantern and rushes to Venkamma and says, "And what is it, Venkamma? Oh, daughter of the mother-in-law, what is it but that this Praya polluter has had royal visits?" "But what is it, Venkamma? What? Oh, you are a nice one too, and 3 legs of a bedstead plus 1 makes 4. Does it or does it not, my daughter?" And seeing Timamma and Stamma, she says, "Oh, don't you see the policeman at the footsteps?" And Timamma swings the lantern, and beneath the bulging veranda stones is seen the gaunt figure of a policeman. And one by one, as the men rise up and gather in the post office house courtyard, the children wake up and rush to the hanging lanterns, broom grass and cattle grass in hand, and Arsinu says, "I'll go." And as he gathers his shawl and goes to Rangamma's door, the policeman says he has no permission to let anyone in. And Sitaram comes along, and Dore and Ramanna and the elders and everybody gathers in the courtyard, half covered and half awake. While from this lane and that lane rises the thin dust of Kartik lights relit. And there is noise in this part of Rangamma's house and that, and there comes the regular cry of Rangamma's mother, "Oh sinners, sinners, to have this in our old age!" And Ramakrishnaya comes and spits across the courtyard, and behind him come Rangamma, a shawl thrown over her shoulders. And then there is seen a light in the front room, and Surappa says, "We cannot see anything from here. Come, let us go up to Sami's." And we all rush up there, and standing on the veranda we see what is happening in Murthy's room. Over against the cracked wall, Murthy is standing, a bright light falling on his tight-lipped face, and the police inspector, a short round man, is standing beside him, a notebook in his hand. In the middle of the room is a heap of books and charkhas and cotton and folded cloth. And policemen in dress are turning them this side and that, and trunks are laid open and boxes are slit through, and sometimes there is laughter. The voice of the police inspector is not heard, but now and again we see Murthy's head nodding. He merely nods and seems to smile at nothing. The police inspector then turns towards Bade Khan, who is now seen clearly in the lantern light, and shouts, "Bind this man." And when they are beginning to pull out ropes from their belts, there is noise in the street below. And there comes Rangegoda, Mada, and a lantern with him, and when he sees the policeman he says something to Mada, and Mada goes away, and before the cock has time to crow 3 times, there is Priya Rachanna and Madanna and Lingaya and Lingaya's woman. And they all gather at Rangamma's door and cry out, "Hele, hele, what are you doing with our master?" And the policeman shouts, "Hey, shut up, you sons of my woman. Hey, hey, do you think we are going to be silent because of your beards and batons? If you are not silent, you will get a marriage greeting today." And Rachanna says, "Oh, I've seen your elders, you son of my concubine, and I shall see." And at this the policeman grows so wild that he waves his lathi, and Rachanna comes forward and says, "Hey, beat me if you have the courage." And Rangamma leans out of the veranda darkness into the starlight and says, "Hey Rachanna, this must not be done." And Rachanna says, "And what is to be done, mother?" "They are going to take away our master." And Rangegoda says something to Mada, and Mada says something to Rachanna, and Rachanna says something in the ear of everyone. And when Murthy is seen on the threshold, the bright light of the police lantern falling on his knit face, Rachanna cries out, "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai!" And policeman rushes at them and bangs them with his lathi, and Rachanna quavers out the louder, "Gandhi Mahatma ki jai!" And other policemen come and bang them too. And the women raise such a clamour and cry that the crows and bats set up an obscure wail, and the sparrows join them from the roofs and eaves, and the cattle rise up in the byre, and the creaking of their bones is heard. And then men rush from this street and that street, and the police inspector, seeing this, hesitates before coming down, and Rachanna barks out again, "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai!" And the police inspector shouts, "Arrest that swine!" And when they come to arrest him, everybody gets around him and says, "No, we'll not give him up." And the police inspector orders, "Give them a licking." And from this side and that there is the bang of the lathi, and men shriek and women weep, and the children begin to cry and groan. And more men go forward towards Murthy, and more policemen beat them, and then Murthy says something to the police inspector, and the police inspector nods his head, and Murthy comes along the veranda and says, "Brothers." And there is such a silence that the Kartik lights glow brighter. "Brothers, in the name of the Mahatma, let there be peace and love and order. As long as there is a God in heaven and purity in our hearts, evil cannot touch us. We hide nothing, we hurt none, and if these gentlemen want to arrest us, let them. Give yourself up to them. That is the true spirit of the Satyagrahi. The Mahatma, Here the police inspector drags him back brutally, but Murthy continues, "The Mahatma has often gone to prison." And the police inspector gets so angry at this that he gives a slap on Murthy's face. But Murthy stands firm and says nothing. Then suddenly Rachanna shouts out from below, "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai! Come brothers, come!" And he rushes up the steps towards Murthy, and suddenly in sinister omen all the Kartik lights seemed quenched. Clay pots and candelabras and banana trunks and house after house became dark, and something so sinister kicked our backs that we all rush up behind Rachanna crying, "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai!" And now the police catch Rachanna and the one behind him and the one behind the one who was behind him, and they spit on them and bind them with ropes, while at the other end of the courtyard is seen Rangamma Bade Khan beside her. Then the police inspector thinks this is the right time to come down, for the lights were all out and the leaders all arrested, and as Murthy is being dragged down the steps, Rachanna's wife and Madanna's wife and Sampanna's wife and Papamma and Sankamma and Viramma come forward and cry out, "Oh, give us back our men and our master, our men and our master." But the police inspector says, "Give them a shoe shower." And the policemen kick them in the back and on the head and in the stomach. And while Rachanna's wife is crying, Madanna's wife is squashed against a wall and her breast squeezed. And Rangegoda, who has stood silent by the tamarind, when he sees this, rushes down and stick in hand gives one bang on the head of a policeman. And the policeman sinks down, and there is such a clamor again that the police inspector shouts, "Disperse the crowd." And he slips round the byre with Murthy before him, while policemen beat the crowd this side and that side, and groans and moans and cries and shouts and coughs and oaths and bangs and kicks are heard, while there is heard, "Mahatma Gandhi ki jai! Mahatma Gandhi ki jai!" And this time it was from the Brahmin quarter that the shouts came, and policemen rushed towards the Brahmins and beat them. And old Ramanna and Dore came forward and said, "We too are Gandhi's men, beat us as much as you like." And the policemen beat them till they were flat on the floor, mud in their mouths and mist in their eyes, and as the dawn was rising over the Kanchamma hill, faces could be seen, and men became silent and women became sobless. And as the morning cattle were going out to the fields and the women were adorning the thresholds for a Kartik morning, Brahmins and Prayas and porters and weavers were marched into the police station. 17 men of Kanthapura were named and locked behind the bars. And the policemen twisted their arms and beat them on their knuckles and spat into their mouths, and when they had slapped and banged and kicked, they let them out one by one they let them out. And they all marched back to Kanthapur, all but Murthy. Him they put into a morning bus, and with one policeman on the right and one policeman on the left they prayed, and we vowed and we fasted, and maybe the gods would hear our feeble voices. Who would hear us if not they? The gods indeed did hear our feeble voices, for this advocate and that advocate came and said, "I shall defend him." Vakils and advocates and barristers came and said, "And we shall plead for him." And the students formed a defense committee and raised a huge meeting. And copper and silver flowed into the collection plate, and merchants came and said, "And here we are when money is needed." And when Murthy heard of all this, he said, "That is not for me. Between truth and me none shall come." And Advocate Ranganna went and saw him and said, "Murthy, the red man's judges, they are not your uncle's grandsons." And Murthy simply said, "If truth is one, all men are one before it." And Ranganna said, "Judges are not for truth but for law. And the English are not for the brown skin but for the white. And the government is not with the people but with the police." And Murthy listened to all this and said, "If that is so, it will have to change. Truth will have to change it. I shall speak that which truth prompts, and truth needeth no defense, and Rangamma spoke this of corruption and that about prejudice, but truth, truth, and truth was all that Murthy said. And old Ranganna, who had grown grey with law on his tongue, got so wild that he banged the prison door behind him and muttered to himself, "To the mire with you." And then came Sadhu Narayan, who had renounced hair and home and was practicing meditation on the banks of the Vedavati. And he said, "Murthy, you are a brave soul and a holy soul, and there is in you the hunger of God, and may He protect you always." But Ranganna comes and tells me, "I cannot change his heart. You are a religious man. Go and speak to him. And I came to see you. I have neither hair nor home, and I have come to tell you this is not just. Defend one must against evil. If not, where is renouncement, continence, austerity, and the control of breath?" To which Murthy says, "You are a holy man, Sadhuji, and I touch your feet in reverence. But if truth needs a defense, and God himself would need one, for as the Mahatma says, truth is God, and I want no soul to come between me and truth." And Sadhu Narayan speaks about the world and its wheels and the clay corruption of men. But Murthy always says truth, truth, and Sadhu Narayan gets up to go and he says, "May at least my blessings be on you." And Murthy falls at his feet and holds them in grateful respect. And it was only after this that Shankar, who was the secretary of the Karwar Congress Committee, comes and says, "Well, Murthy, if such be your decision, my whole soul is with you." Gandhiji says, "A satyagrahi needs no advocates, he is his own advocate." And how many of us did go to prison in 1921 and never had touched the shadow of an advocate? "I am an advocate," you will say, "but you know I am an advocate for only those who cannot defend themselves." And Murthy says, "Then if you agree with me, brother, there can be nothing on my conscience." And Murthy's lips tremble and he falls at Shankar's feet. But when Shankar lifts him up, Murthy says, "No, brother, you are my elder and a householder. I need your blessings." And Shankar says, "If so, it is. My blessings are always with you." And Murthy feels so exalted that he goes to Shankar and embraces him and says, "Brother, are you with me?" And Shankar says, "I am with you, Murthy." And then they sit for a while holding each other by the hand, and as the warder comes and says, "Now it is time for you to go, sir," Shankar rises up and says, "But I can hold meetings for you, Murthy." And Murthy says, "Of course, brother." And Shankar goes straight to Advocate Ranganna, and Advocate Ranganna says, "Certainly." Then he sees Khadi shop Dasappa, and Dasappa says, "Oh, most certainly." And then he sees the president of the college union, and this one says, "We are wherever you are." And so Shankar sends for his volunteers and says, "A meeting in the Gandhi Maidan today." And volunteer after volunteer goes out to the cloth bazaar and the fish bazaar and the flower bazaar and the grain bazaar. And as the noon cools down, there is a huge crowd in the Gandhi Maidan, and the volunteers are there in khadi kurta and Gandhi cap, crying out, "Order, brother, order! Please take your seats, brother, please!" And Shankar goes up to the platform and there is a huge ovation. And Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. And Dasappa comes and there is an ovation again. And Advocate Ranganna comes and there is an even greater ovation. For everybody knew he had lately thrown open his private temple to the Prayas. And with folded hands, people hymn up, "Vande Mataram." Then they all squat down, and Shankar and Ranganna and Dasappa make speeches about the incorruptible qualities of Murthy, and they say how the foreign government want to crush all self-respect, and they then speak of Charkha and Ahimsa and Hindu-Muslim unity. And somebody cries out, "And what about the untouchables?" And Shankar says, "Of course we are for them. Why has not the Mahatma adopted an untouchable?" And somebody cries out again, "Oh, our religion is going to be desecrated by you youngsters." And Shankar says, "Brother, if you have anything to say, please come up to the platform." And the man says, "And you will allow me to speak?" And Shankar says, "We have no enemies." And the man is seen coming from the other end of the Maidan, a lean, tall man in darbar turban and filigree shawl, and he wears gold-cased rudrakshi beads at his neck, and he goes up the platform and says, "Brothers, you have all heard the injurious attacks against the government and the police and many other things. I am a toothless old man and I have seen many a change pass before me, and may I say this, all this is very good. But if the white men shall leave us tomorrow, it will not be Ramarajya we shall have, but the rule of the 10-headed Ravana." What did we have? Pray, before the British came, disorder, corruption and egoism. Disorder, corruption and egoism, I say. He continued, though there were many shouts and booings against him. And the British came, and they came to protect us, our bones and our dharma. I say dharma, and I mean it. For hath not the Lord said in the Gita, "Whensoever there is ignorance and corruption, I come. For I, says Krishna, am the defender of dharma, and the British came to protect our dharma." And the great Queen Victoria said it when she put the crown of our sacred country on her head and became our beloved sovereign. And when she died, may she have a serene journey through the other worlds. And when she died, you are too young to know, but ask of your grandfathers how many a camphor was lit before the temple gods, and how many a sacrificial fire was created, and how many a voice did rise up to the heavens in incantation. For not only was she a great queen, a mother queen, but the most courageous defender of our faith. Tell me, did she not protect it better than any Mohammedan prince had ever done? Now I am an old man, you are all young. Things change, but what I fear for tomorrow is not the disorder in the material world, but the corruption of castes and of the great traditions our ancestors have bequeathed us. When the British rule disappears, there will be neither Brahmin nor Pariah, Vaishya nor Shudra, nay, neither Mohammedan nor Christian. And our eternal dharma will be squashed like a louse in a child's hair. My young brothers, let not such confusion of castes anger our minds, and let the religion of Vasisht and Manu, Shankar and Vidyaranya go unmuddied to the self-created one. Now I have said all I have to say. But before he has stopped, somebody says, "So you are a Swami's man?" And the old man says, "And of course I am, and I have the honor to be." And the Swami has just received 1200 acres of wetland from the government. "Do you know that?" says a youngster. "Of course, and pray what else should he do if he is offered a Rajdakshina, a royal gift?" And the youngster says, "So the Swami is a government man?" And the old man says, "The Swami is neither for the government nor against it, but he is for all who respect the ancient ways of our race, and not for all this Gandhi and Gindhi who cannot pronounce even a Gayatri, and who say there is neither caste nor creed and we are all equal to one another, while the Swami..." And somebody cries out, "Do you know the Swami has been received by the governor?" And Shankar rises up and says, "No interruptions, please." And the old man answers, "And of course, but why not? And do not the Dharma Shastras say the king is the protector of faith?" And I cry out, "Long live George V, Emperor!" And he hobbled down the platform. Then came youngster after youngster and said Murthy was excommunicated by the Swami, for Murthy was for Gandhiji and the untouchables, and the Swami was paid by the British to do their dirty work. "I have grown in the mutt," says one, "and I have known what they do. The mutt, brothers, is the best place for retired high court judges, police inspectors and God-dedicated concubines, and they are not with us, are they?" And Shankar rises up again and says, "Now it is better we talk of other things." But the young man continues, "The whole trouble has been hatched by the mutt." Then Advocate Ranganna gets up and says, "And I too have been excommunicated, for I have thrown open the temple to the Pariahs." And there is a violent ovation and Ranganna continues. And I know one thing too that few know, and it is time I said it in the open, and everybody began to stand up and the volunteers cried, "Sit down please, sit down." And when there is silence again, Ranganna continues, "Not long ago, I received a visit of a man and he comes to me and says, the Swami would like to see you. And I say, if the Swami likes to see me, I am indeed most honored. And state I go the next morning with fruits and flowers and the Swami receives me with smiles and blessings and he says, I need your help Ranganna. And I say, of course everything is yours Swamiji. And the Swami says there is much pollution going on and I want to fight against it. And I say I am for fighting against all pollution. And the Swami says for some time there has been too much of this Praya business. We are Brahmins and not Prayas. When the Prayas will have worn out their karma and will have risen in the waters of purification, nobody will prevent them from becoming Brahmins, even sages in their next lives. But this Gandhi, who is no doubt a very fine person, is meddling with the Dharma Shastras, the writ laws of the ancient sages, and I am not for it. He said he would like to see me, and I saw him and told him what I thought of it. But he said we did not interpret the Dharma Shastras correctly, and of course it was ridiculous to say that, for who should know better, he or I? But one cannot break the legs of the ignorant. Now what Swami says, we want to fight against this anti-untouchable campaign, and I may tell you in confidence the powers that be, well, they are with the guardians of our trusted traditions. Swamiji, I said, how can you accept the help of a foreign government? Do not the Dharma Shastras themselves call the foreigners untouchables? And the Swami said, governments are sent by the divine will and we may not question it. And he added, and I may say the government has promised to help us morally and materially. And at this I got so angry that I rose to go. But the Swami held me by the two hands and said, do take your seat. But Ranganna said, no, I cannot. And it was on that very day I took the vow to open our temple to the Prayas, and that is why I opened it to them. There was a long ovation, and therefore, brothers, know for sure what religion is wearing behind its saffron robes. Choose between a saint like Mahatma Gandhi, who has given up land and lust and honors and comfort and has dedicated his life to the country, and these fattened Brahmins who want to frighten us with their excommunications once the government has paid them well. At this the police inspector comes up and says, I put you under arrest. And Advocate Ranganna answers, well, on what authority? And the police inspector shows him a magistrate's order, and Ranganna offers himself up to the police, and there is a huge hoarse cry and ovation after ovation rises. Gandhi Mahatma ki Jai, Vande Mataram. Processions immediately form themselves, and with volunteers on either side they march through bazaar and street and lane, and women rush to the veranda and children follow them, still muttering the multiplication tables, and as dusk falls and lights flash from house to house, so shrill rises the cry of Mahatma Gandhi ki Jai, that by the Imperial Bank buildings police cars are already waiting and the crowd is violently dispersed. And when the morning came, the papers were full of it, and Rangamma's blue paper brought it all to us, and that is how we knew it all. And then we looked at each other and said, so that is how it is with Bhatt. And everybody said, and so it is. And Rangamma said, that is why Bade Khan was so often seen with him. And Nanjamma said, do you remember, sister, he was nowhere to be seen on that awful night. And everybody said, yes, surely, and fools we were not to have seen it earlier, and we all felt the kernel of our hearts burn, for Bhatt had walked our streets a copper pot in hand and we had fed him. Only Ramakrishna said, there is still many a good heart in this world, else the sun would not rise as he does, nor the Himavati flow by the Kanchamma hill. And all looked at the stars and said, yeah, the stars of the seven sages hang above us. And as a wall lizard clucked propitiously, we all beat our knuckles upon the floor and named the holy name, and there came with it such peace into our hearts that we walked back home with the light in our souls. And somewhere beyond the Babur Mount, somewhere beyond the Babur Mount and the Kanchamma hill, out against the sky that rises over Karwar, out over the river, there seemed to stand, as one might have said, the supple firm figure of Murthy, a Gandhi cap upon his head and a northern shirt flowing down his waist to the knees, and there was something in his eyes that shone and showed that he had grown even more sorrowful and calm. And week after week passed, and Rangamma's blue paper brought us this news and that news. And Pandit Venkatesha said, why should I not make it come? And he too began to receive it every Saturday evening, and Rangagowda came and said, Rangamma, Rangamma, I do not know how to read, but my little mosquito goes to school, and if he is worth the milk he has drunk, he will read it out to us. And he too began to get the paper through postman Subbiah. And evening after evening we gathered on Rangamma's veranda, and when Ramakrishna had explained to us a chapter from the Vedant Sutras, kneading vermicelli or shaping wicks for the festivals, we began to speak about Murthy, while our men sat at the village gate rubbing the snuff or chewing the tobacco leaf, and it seems they said many wicked things about the government. Then Sinu would sometimes go to Karwar with a Friday cart and come back with a Tuesday morning cart, and he would tell us about Sankar and Advocate Ranganna and Sitaramu. And Vasudev too would sometimes go in a Skeffington estate lorry. And he would sometimes slip through the evening and tell us about Murthy and the case. And everybody said, the goddess will free him. She will appear before the judges and free him. And Rangamma vowed she would offer a Kanchi sari to Kanchamma if Murthy were released. And Ratan said she would have a 1008 flame ceremony performed. And Nanjamma said she would give the goddess a silver belt. And Prior Achanna said he would walk the holy fire, and all said the goddess will never fail us. She will free him from the clutches of the red man. But Vasudev, who was a city boy, said, no sister, they will give him a good 6 months. And we all said, no, no, never. And Vasudev said, well, think what you will. I know these people. And Rangamma then suddenly said, let me go to the city and see cousin Sitaramu. He is an advocate and he can tell me something about it. And Nanjamma said, I too will come with you, sister, for I have to go to my daughter's confinement. And now or in 3 weeks is all the same to me. And that is why one Pushi, a night, Kitta put the bulls to the cart, and Rangamma and Nanjamma went down to Karwar to see Murthy. And when they had bathed and said their prayers, Rangamma said to Sitaramu, Sitaramu, who is looking after Murthy's affair? And Sitaramu said, why, Sankar? And she said, why not go and see him? And he said, of course. And he put on the turban and the coat, and they went straight to Sankar. And when Sankar saw Rangamma, he said, Aunt, it is a long time since I saw you. How are things with you? And Rangamma answered, everything is safe, but I have to come to speak about Murthy. And Sankar said, I love him like a brother, and I have found no better Gandhist. And Rangamma said, why, he is the saint of our village. And Sankar said, someday he will do holy deeds. And Rangamma said, is there nothing to be done to free him from prison? And Sankar said, we have done all we can, but the police say it is he who arranged the assault of the priors on the police. And Rangamma said, Shiva, Shiva, never such a thing would our Murthy do. And Sankar said, of course, aunt. And Rangamma said, is there nothing I can do here? And Shankar said, nothing for the moment, but stay and wait for the results. And Rangamma said, so be it, and that is why she did not come back even for the harvest reapings. And when she came back for the corn distribution, Barber Venkata said, and mother, what about Murthappa? And Prior Achanna took his two measures and said, and mother, what have the red man's government said about Murthappa? And Boatman Siddha said, if this government's people were really sons of their father, they would have asked us to stand and bear witness before them. And Goldsmith Nanjundia said, oh, let them do what they like. Our murti is like gold, the more you heat it, the purer it comes from the crucible. And the women said, oh, when you strike a cow, you will fall into the hell of hells and suffer 1,000,008 tortures and be born an ass. And if this government cannot tell the difference between a deer and a panther, well, it will fall into the mouth of the precipice. And rice-pounding Razamma, who had an evil tongue, said, may this government be destroyed. And she spat 3 times, and so from day to day people said this against the government and that against the police, and when our Rangegoda got dismissed from his patelship, they all cried out, oh, this is against the ancient laws. A patel is a patel from father to son, from son to grandson, and this government wants to eat up the food of our ancestors and everybody as they passed by the Kenchamma grove. Cried out, Goddess, when the demon came to eat our babes and rape our daughters, you came down to destroy him and protect us. Oh, Goddess, destroy this government. And when the women went to cut grass for the cows, they made a song, and mowing the grass they sang. Goddess, Goddess, Goddess Kanchamma, the mother-in-law has wicked eyes and the sister-in-law has hungry stomach. Betel nuts never become stone, and a virgin never will become pregnant. Red is the earth round the goddess. For thou hast slain the red demon, Goddess, Goddess, the mother-in-law has wicked eyes, and betel nuts will never become stone. And Kanchi Narsamma, who had a long tongue, added, lean is the Brahmin priest mother, and fat is he when he becomes Bhat mother. Fat is he when he becomes Bhat mother. And he will take the road to Kashi, for gold has stuck in his stomach, and he will take the road to Kashi. And the sister-in-law has hungry stomach, betel nuts will never become stone. To tell you the truth, but left us after harvest on a pilgrimage to Kashi. But don't they say, sister, the sinner may go to the ocean, but the water will only touch his knees. And when Rangamma went back after the corn distributions, she went straight to Shankar instead of staying with cousin Sitaramu. For she had seen much of Shankar, and she had liked him, and he had liked her, and he had said to her, when you come to Karwar next, come and stay with me, aunt, and you will help me in my work. And Rangamma had said, I am poor of mind and of little learning. What can I do for you, Sankru? And he had answered, that does not matter, aunt. What we need is force and fervor. And Shankar said, I am living with my little daughter and my aged mother, and you may perhaps arrange my papers and look after the Congress correspondence. And though Rangamma was the humblest of women, she liked this, and she said, if the gods choose me, I will not say nay. And that's why she went to stay with Sankru. And when Waterfall Venkamma heard of this, she said, oh, this widow has now begun to live openly with her men. And she spat on the house and said, this man had her and that man had her. And she began to say she would go to the courts and have back Rangamma's property. For land and lust and wifely royalty go badly together, like oil and soap and hot water. But she said, let Bhatt come and he will do it for me. But our Rangamma was as tame as a cow, and she only said, one cannot stitch up the mouths of others, so let them say what they like. And as everybody knew, Shankar was an ascetic of a man and had refused marriage after he had lost his wife. And everybody had said, this is not right, Sankru. You are only 26 and you have just put up the advocate's signboard and you will soon begin to earn, and when you have a 9-pillared house you will need a Lakshmi like goddess to adorn it. But Shankar simply forced a smile and said, I have had a Lakshmi and I, a sinner, could not even keep her, and she has left me a child and that is enough. But his old father came and said, But no, Shankru, you cannot do that. You are our eldest son and you have to give us at least a grandson so that when we are dead our means would be satisfied. But Shankar smiled back again and said, If you want the marriage thread to be tied in an ocean of tears, I shall. But otherwise I will not. I have a daughter and I will bring her up. And you will come and stay with me and we shall have a household running. And the old mother wept and the old father knit his eyebrows. But Shankar smiled back and said, I shall obey you. But they did not press him further and they said his wife Usha was such a godlike woman, she would never utter a word loud and never say nay to anything. And when she walked the streets, they always said what a holy wife she was and beaming with her wifehood, and never a mother-in-law had a daughter-in-law like her, and they both said, well, we can understand Shankru. When one has lost Usha, nothing can replace her, and they never again gave Shankar's horoscope to anyone, and they came to stay with him and look after his sanctum and his child. And the old father, who was a retired taluk office clerk, knew how to write English, and he said he would address envelopes for Congress meetings, and sometimes he went to join the Sappa who had opened a khadi shop in the town. And when the Sappa was ill or away on Congress duty, it was old Venktaramaiah who looked after the shop, measuring out yard after yard of khadi and saying, This is from the Badnawal center and that is from the Prayas of Siddhapura, and this upper cloth is almost the work of the Mahatma, for where do you think it comes from? Sabarmati itself. And when a young man came to buy a towel or a pair of dhotis, he would say, Hey, have you read the latest Young India? And if he should say nay, he would tell them they were a set of buffaloes fit to be driven with kick and knout. And thrusting the paper into the young man's hands, he would offer him a chair and say, Read this, it is useful, or skip through this, it is less useful. And when children came, he gave them pinches and peppermints and told them stories of Tilak and Gandhi and Chittaranjan Das, and such funny stories they were too that they called him Gandhi Grandpa. And his wife cooked food for the family, and she said, One day Shankar will earn as much as Advocate Ranganna and he will buy a motor car too. But Shankar laughed and said, Mother, you must forget your dreams. Don't you see, I am not a man to make money. At which Tamma said this about what Ramachandra had said about Shankar's reputation, and that about Professor Patwardhan's appreciation. Your son Shankar, he is a saint, and when he walked the main bazaar, they used to say, Look there goes the ascetic advocate. People sometimes looked at his khadi coat and his rough yarn turban and laughed at this walking advocate, and others said, No, he follows the principles of the Mahatma. And what, pray, are the principles of the Mahatma? Why, don't you know Shankar does not take a single false case, and before he takes a client he says to him, Swear before me you are not the criminal. And the client says this and that, but Shankar always comes back to the point and says, if you do not tell me the whole truth, well, I may be forced to withdraw in the middle of the case. And indeed, as everyone knows, he withdrew in the middle of the case between shopkeeper Ramachetty and contractor Sinappa over false accounts, between Borhelli, Nanjudia and Tipaiya, and you know how he withdrew in the last criminal case they had in Karwar. You see, this is what really happened. One Rahman Khan was supposed to have tried to murder one Subha Chetty, for Subha Chetty had taken away his mistress Dasi. And everybody said, Poor Subha Chetty, poor Subha Chetty. And everybody said he will win the case easily, and Subha Chetty was an old client of Shankar, and so he goes to Shankar and tells him the story and swears it is all true. And Shankar says, now this is going to be a criminal case, and if you have hidden a thing small as a hair, you will come to grief, Subha Chetty. And Subha Chetty sheds many a tear and says he is a good householder, and he would never tell a lie, and the lingam in his hand is witness to it. And Shankar takes the case and prepares the papers, and he says he will have to see Dasi. But Subha Chetty says, Dasi is very ill, father, but her word is my word and my word is hers. And Shankar says, bring her before the sessions. And Subha Chetty says, if Shiva wills, so it shall be. And Shankar says, then you may go. And the case is filed and summonses are sent and the hearing arrives, and Subha Chetty is the last to come and says, the wheels broke down and the rains, how they poured and this and that. And when Dasi comes to the bar, she is hailed as a first cowed cow, and she turns this way and she turns that way, and she does her hair and wipes her eyes and stands up and sits down and bites her sari fringe. And Subha Chetty gets angry and says, stop this concubine show. And when the cross-examination begins, it is Advocate Ramanna who begins to heckle her with questions, and Dasi breaks into a fit of sobs and says something. And Subha Chetty cries, woman, woman! And Dasi runs up to the advocate and falls at his feet and says, I know nothing, father, nothing. And when Shankar hears that, he asks the judge for permission to speak to his client. And he says to Subha Chetty, on your mother's honor, tell me if you have not concocted the story to pinch Rahman Khan's coconut garden. And Subha Chetty trembles and says, no, no, Shankarappa. But Shankar has seen the game, and he turns to the magistrate and says, I beg to ask your lordship for an adjournment. And the magistrate, who knows Shankar's ways, says, well, you have it. When Shankar gets back home, he asks Subha Chetty to speak the truth. And Subha Chetty tells him how he had enjoyed Dasi to go and live with Rahman Khan and to enrage him against Subha Chetty with drink and smoke and lust, and with drink and smoke and lust Rahman Khan had cried out he would murder that Subha Chetty, and had run out with an axe, and Subha Chetty had cried out murder, murder in the middle of the street, and Dasi had run out innocently and tried to calm Rahman Khan, who was so weak that he had rolled upon the earth an opium lump. And when Shankar heard this, he said, go and confess this to the magistrate. And the next day the magistrate gave him 3 years rigorous imprisonment, with 1 year for Dasi, and in public Shankar had asked pardon of Rahman Khan, who got 6 months too. It is from that day that people said, take care when you go to Shankar, he will never take a false case. And he took but the lowest fee, and when the clients were poor, he said to his clerk, make an affidavit for Suranna's Dasanna. Stamps, private account, please. And people began to come to him more, and never was there a man in Karwar that had risen so quickly in public esteem and legal success as he. But he never bought a car, and never dressed in hat and boots and suit, and always smiled at everyone. And when the court was over, he did not go like Barrister Shastri and Advocate Raja Rao to the bar club to have whiskey and soda and God knows what. But he went straight to the floor above the khadi shop where the new Hindi teacher Surya Menon held classes, and when Shankar had time, he divided the class into 2 and gave a lesson to the latecomers. He said Hindi would be the national language of India, and though Kannada is good enough for our province, Hindi must become the national tongue. And whenever he met a man in the street, and he did not say, how are you, in Kannada, but took to the northern manner and said, Ram Ram. But what was shameful was the way he began to talk Hindi to his mother, who understood not a word of it, but he said she would learn it one day. And he spoke nothing but Hindi to his daughter, and if by chance he used an English word as they do in the city, he had a little closed port with a slit in the lid into which he dropped a coin, and every month he opened it and gave it to the Congress fund. And if any of his friends should utter an English word in his house, he would say, "Drop me a coin." And the friends got angry and called him a fanatic. But he said there must be a few fanatics to wash the wheel of law, and he would force his friends to drop the coin, and if they refused, he dropped one himself. And he was a fanatic too in his dress. You know, sister, when he went to a marriage party, he used to say, "Everyone must be in khadi or I will not go." And they said, "Oh, one must have a nice dharmavar sari for the bride. She cannot look like a street sweeper." And he would say, "Well, have your dharmavar sari and send your money to Italian yarn makers and German color manufacturers and let our pariahs and peasants starve." And when they pleaded just one dharmavar sari, he would say, "I am not the head of the family, but if you wear anything but khadi, I will not go." And that is how nobody in their house nor in their cousin's house had any new dharmavar saris. And when they went for any kumkum and haldi invitation, they put on their old saris and slipped out through the back door. And he also made the whole family fast on this day, because it is the anniversary of the day of the Mahatma was imprisoned. Fast on that day for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and on another day in memory of the day of Tilak's death, and some day he would have made everyone fast for every cough and sneeze of the Mahatma. Fasting is good for the mind, he would say, and even on the days he fasted, he was in full spirits and went to court and spun his 300 yards of yarn every morning instead of his prayers. And he said the gods would be happy when the hungry stomachs had food. But what a good expression he had on his face, sister. He looked a veritable Dharmraj. And Rangamma told us never a man smiled more and sang more at home than he. And he was always the earliest to rise and the last to go to bed. Yet he was always in the best of health. Lemon water and gymnastics and lemon water can keep the plague at the doorstep, he used to say. And to tell you the truth, never had Rangamma looked so healthy and serene as she did then. She was nearing 40, but she looked hardly 33, and there was not a grey hair on her head. And she could work too. Then she could talk and write and hold classes, and sometimes she even went, they said, to meetings with Shankar. And once Shankar had asked her to say a few words about Murthy, and she had stood up and spoken of Murthy the good, Murthy the religious, and Murthy the noble, and she had found no more words, and she had come down from the platform and had begun to shiver, and tears had come into her eyes. But she said that was the first time, but if she had ever to speak again, she would have no such fears. And of course we knew she was a tight-jawed person, and she could speak like a man. Rangamma came back from Karwar for the Magh cattle fair, and 2 days later we heard that the Red Man's judges had given Murthy 3 months rigorous imprisonment. The whole afternoon no man left his veranda, and not a mosquito moved in all Kanthapura. We all fasted. The next day the rain set in, and it poured and it plundered all the fields and the woods, and Ramakrishnaya, going to spit over the railings of the veranda, stumbled against a pillar and, falling, lost consciousness. And that very night, without saying a word, without giving a sigh, he closed his eyes forever. And everybody said, "The rains have come. Oh, what shall we do for the cremations? Oh, what?" And Pandit Venkatesha immediately sent for the beadles and asked them to raise a mango pandal on the banks of the Himavati. And the good pariahs, they worked hour after hour during the night, and when the next morning the body was washed and the corpse tied to the bamboo, the rains suddenly lifted themselves up, and behind the jackfruit tree the sun rose like a camphor censer alit, and while the waters were still gurgling in the gutters, the procession hurried on, and they lighted the pyre in the open. And the head burst out a moment later, and we lifted our eyes to the heavens and muttered, He goes the way of the saints. And Rangamma vowed she would take his bones to Kashi. But all of a sudden the river began to swell, and when it came crawling by the pyre, people asked, "What shall we do?" "Oh, what?" But the swell bubbled out by the pyre, and Rangamma gave a sigh. And when the body was ashed down whole and only a few cinders lay blinking behind the bones, a huge swell churned round the hill and swept the bones and ashes away. And we all cried out, "Narayan, Narayan." And that night, sister, as on no other night, no cow would give its milk. And all the night a steady rain kept pattering on the tiles, and the cows pranced about their mothers and groaned, "Lord, may such be the path of our outgoing soul." Thank you.